David Griscom read in his book today, but we are joined by the U.S. House of Representatives member Khanna. He is of California's 17th district. He was also the co-chair of Bernie Sanders 2020. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
First, I'm just curious your initial reactions to the Trump administration's first months, both the DOGE driven by Elon Musk, which is now, I think, kind of a little bit in the at least public rear view, and the tariffs that he imposed and sort of slightly retracted.
Well, they've created economic chaos. I mean, they took an economy that was relatively strong in the macro, even though people were struggling with prices and people were struggling with costs. And they really pushed us where people are now talking about recession. And that is because business investment is drying up. Prices have been going to go up for everything from inputs for manufacturing to consumer goods. And you've at the same time had the slashing of federal contracts, of science investment, of federal jobs. And so it's really taken a sledgehammer to the American economy. And there hasn't been any savings. I mean, Elon Musk talked about $2 trillion of cuts. We've got, of course, a $2 trillion deficit. And he said, I'm going to cut $2 trillion. Then he talked about $1 trillion. Then it's about now $80 billion on his own estimate. And we'll see how true that is, though it's taken a sledgehammer to medical research and scientific advances. And at the same time, the House Republican budget increases the deficits by 3.8 trillion over 10 years, meaning they take the 2.1 trillion a year to 2.5 trillion. We are currently at around 7% deficit spending of GDP, and they take it to 8%. And so they have no leg to stand on fiscal responsibility.
We sort of fast forwarded to the realization that this was a lie, that there was all of these wasteful spending programs by the government, and we could just get rid of those and all of a sudden everyone could pay less taxes. My kind of issue is that it's less that the Republicans won that argument and more that the Democrats had sort of not been able to deliver the argument that actually government is vital. These things are really important. What would you say to that this is less about the rhetorical power of Donald Trump and more about basically the party that I only vote for, I don't vote for Republicans, failing kind of the mission that maybe FDR or even JFK understood a little bit?
Sometimes we don't appreciate things till they're snatched away from us. And I do think that this is an opportunity for the Democrats to remind people that government is an extraordinary force of good in ordinary people's lives, that it is the check to the concentration of power by large, wealthy interests, that it is the one body in this country that's supposed to speak for people because people have a say in it, and that it has delivered for us Social Security, the minimum wage, Medicare, Medicaid, collective bargaining, the Affordable Care Act, that we need government to make childcare possible for everyone, to make affordable college free and vocational education possible, to make sure that Medicare is a human right and reduce the extraordinary costs in the system of healthcare. Now, we can acknowledge that there's waste in government, but the waste in government is the fossil fuel subsidies for big oil. The waste in government is Medicare Advantage that's ripping off the American people by pretending that people are sicker than they are and how they're charging us. The waste in government is the big pharma companies that are charging us an arm and a leg for the prescription drugs. The waste in government is the defense contractors that are making on average $5 million a year while charging monopoly prices. You want to go after the waste in government, go after the private cap of government agencies for profit.
I mean, that's really, really what my thing is. I've been obsessed with the Truman Committee. Harry Truman back in World War II went around.
Same president.
Exactly. And I feel like it kind of is a signal of how sort of far we've fallen, that we have somebody who would have been investigated by Truman, maybe the type of person, contractors, leading this effort into look for waste, fraud, abuse. It kind of seems a little bit farcical to me.
Well, look, I took a page from inspiration of Truman. One of the proudest things I've done in Congress is I led as a freshman or sophomore congressman the investigation into TransDigm. And TransDigm admitted that they were fleecing the American people, charging 1,000% markups in parts that they were purchasing. And they actually agreed to reimburse the government $16 million. Now, that's a small sum, but it showed that an investigation of Congress can result in an impact. And I was back then warning that one day we were going to move to trillion-dollar defense budgets, 56% of our budget. And people were laughing at me. Sure enough, we're now over $1 trillion of defense. That is what we ought to be going after in terms of the sole source contracting, the monopoly practices. That's where there's savings. And look, Musk actually, with Obama and Ash Carter, disrupted some of that with SpaceX in terms of NASA and Defense Department. And when he first got there, some of us wrote and pushed him, say, look, you want to go after the big spending, go after defense. But they had no interest in doing that. They're increasing defense by $150 billion.
How do you view the space sort of privatization stuff? Because I remember following that closely when I was in college with NASA and the introduction of SpaceX. And I kind of feel like there's something that's been lost when we did that, which is that when NASA was doing the sort of research in the decades prior to that, that was for the public, right? If a space shuttle exploded, well, at least we learned something, or a satellite exploded, at least we learned something that we can continue our public mission. And here's all these products that were developed by NASA. And now it's all under private controls. And, I'm curious, do you think the advantage of having this under private control, whether it's, Jeff Bezos and Musk are able to advance, shipping or through space or something like that, do you think that has been compensated or compensates the loss that we have from a sort of public-minded space program?
Well, America's always worked best when, in my view, there's a public mission, but the private sector has contributed. I mean, when we were trying to go to the moon, that's what gave rise to Silicon Valley. The semiconductor chips that were produced for going to the moon were produced in Silicon Valley by private companies, by the Fairchild and Intel. Now, they wouldn't have existed if it weren't NASA buying from them. So they gave rise to Silicon Valley. The private sector fueled public sort of missions. And I have no problem if NASA has public sort of missions with the public interest at heart if they have private sector companies that are competing and disrupting the industry. Look, it was Boeing and Lockheed that had the contract before that. So they were private companies. They just had a very inefficient contracts where it used to cost a ton to put a satellite in space. And SpaceX did reduce the cost and showed that it was reusable. So I view that not as disrupting the public sector, but disrupting the monopoly of private sector that was supplying the public sector.
Yeah, and this is why I think you're one of the more interesting representatives we could have on, both with, who you represent in Silicon Valley, who is, typically not someone socialist like me, super trustworthy, but also co-chair of Bernie Sanders campaigns and generally one of the more progressive representatives. And, I don't want to get into the horrors of socialism thing. You talked about that with Ben Burgess. Suffice to say, we have a disagreement. My practical issue is more that I worry that we're too often shadowboxing with Stalin when we have China that is kind of eating our lunch right now. When you look at BYD cars, when you look at the high-speed rail that they've deployed over the past 15 years. And I feel like that, I read Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's Abundance book. I didn't feel like I don't think the courts being a little bit more fluid is really the whole picture there. I feel like it's when Xi Jinping has the DeepSeek AI founders in for a photo op to glorify China. He says specifically, we need a private and public spirited economies, but also the private stuff needs to be for the nation. Now, I would say it should be for humanity generally or for the working class, but I'm curious, do you think we have that ethos here with the type of people we are trusting with the means of production in this country? I worry that they're mainly motivated for their own profit.
Well, that's why I've called for a White House Economic Development Council. I think to build industry in America, to build again in America, which is the ethos of Ezra and Derek Thompson's book, is going to require more than a better state capacity and better permitting. It's going to require federal investment. It's going to require an investment in the workforce. It's going to require buying things if people build them here. And that has been how we have developed from Hamilton to Lincoln to FDR. It has been with a robust public investment with the private sector. Now, China, I think, in some ways copied that model. They have their own problems. I mean, if you go to some of the local towns in China, their real estate has collapsed, and you literally have local governments taking away a property and money, and in some cases jailing people because their local towns have a revenue crunch. So China has its own own problems, and they've totally neglected consumer well-being at the expense of a few state-sponsored companies, but it hasn't exactly been a thriving middle class. But what we need to do, instead of looking at China, is look at our own history from how FDR developed America. And in FDR's America, I've often said Elon Musk would be a dollar a year person, where he was actually there to build things, not to dismantle things. In fact, I was just in New York for this Memorial Day weekend, and I saw at the Rockefeller Center, there's a plaque with Rockefeller's quote where he says that I hope that the ambitions of people will be put to a public purpose, and that the dross of selfishness will melt away. And of course, Rockefeller was a monopolist and had his own challenges, but back then there was some sense of the public good, the fact that business was subordinate to the public interest, not that the public interest was supposed to be in service of business. And that is the balance we need to get right again. I've often said Silicon Valley needs to be in the service of America, not America in the service of Silicon Valley.
Do you think we can get there without another 1929 crash? And how does, your work in Congress, how can we do that without the pain of another Great Depression?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, unfortunately, in American history, the times of great challenge and great reformation has been after crisis. But I would say Donald Trump is crisis enough. We don't need a depression. We have someone who's dismantling the institutions we know. He's basically getting rid of medical research, decimating NIH, getting rid of 50% of our investment in advanced technology, advanced science with the NSF, getting rid of so much of the FDA that approves new drugs, banning foreign students from coming to places like Harvard, taking a sledgehammer to our universities. He is openly talking about defying the courts, creating a situation where people can be disappeared if they speak out and express unpopular opinions. This is crisis. We don't need a Great Depression. And I believe that what we should recognize is there's a deep angst in America, and anxiety in America, and anger in America, because too many people feel that they didn't have self-worth, self-respect, that they were passed over with all of the activity in Silicon Valley or Wall Street. Not just the financial activity, the media focus, the sense of glorification. It used to be we glorified workers in America who built America, and then we started glorifying big tech and financial leaders. And so what we need, in my view, is a Marshall Plan for America, a vision of I call it economic patriotism, a real vision to rebuild every part of this country. And I believe that should be the vision of the Democratic Party going forward post-Trump. Trump is the crisis. He is our Great Depression. Musk is our Andrew Mellon. I mean, Andrew Mellon in the 1920s was basically Herbert Hoover's Treasury Secretary, saying exactly what Musk was saying: get rid of government. Government's just for the weak. We want ambitious, enterprising men to take over. And that led to FDR. So I'm hoping we'll have a progressive era.
Yeah, and 100%. And the Build Back Better to bipartisan infrastructure bill, like, as part of the folks who was pushing to make that more larger and more sort of a bigger bill, do you think that is the sort of direction that we need to continue heading, is those sorts of infrastructure problems that, and maybe get the people working faster? Like, I'm curious what the next sort of stab is, or do you go at something like healthcare?
Well, I think we have to deliver on a few key things. Let's first raise the wage. I mean, that was unconscionable that we had the presidency, the House, and the Senate, and we couldn't get the minimum wage raised for $7.25. I had called for firing the parliamentarian. People thought I was crazy, but now the Republicans are talking about firing the parliamentarian. AMLO did raise the wage from $4.65 a day to $15 a day in Mexico, and President Sheinbaum followed him. That's what we should focus on. We should focus on childcare. That's such a huge cost to families. Of course, we should focus on healthcare. I've been a long supporter of Medicare for all, not just because that's a human right. That would substantially decrease costs in America. And this idea that it would increase taxes is just nonsense. What it would mean is people would pay a fee for Medicare that is much, much less than they would be paying to their private insurance companies. And employers would be paying to Medicare much less than what they'd be paying private insurance by definition, because the private insurance and hospitals and big pharma won't be sucking out the profits in the system. So those are the things that we focus on. Then I think in terms of the economic renewal of this country, My view is that we should be investing in every community to have diverse economies. If there's an advanced factory that can come there, great. If we can have a university there or a hospital there for jobs and jobs that don't require a college degree, terrific. What are the investments we can make in partnership with local community leaders to bring back a Lorain, Ohio, a Johnstown, a Milwaukee, and create economic, dynamic economies across this country?